including in the final contract, the printed contract. And what that means is, for instance, I know it's something we're not talking about today, but this would be a recommendation. Tuition development, professional development tuition reimbursement, pardon me. We might have a recommendation there that says, although you can apply for this at any point in the year, our recommendation is to apply for it at the very beginning of the fiscal year in case the fund runs out, right? So that's an example of a suggestion we might make that is not a directive, right? It's not contract language that's actually inserted into the contract. It's just advice saying, heads up, you might have a training that occurs later on in the year. It might be occurring in, towards the end of the fiscal year. Go ahead and submit for it as soon as you can, because you want to be sure to lock down those funds so that they're available for you. So that's also something. Please feel free to ask any questions you wish during the presentation. As Lawrence mentioned, we're going to be observing people who we can verify that they're a member and that they're participating, not just some random drop-in, and those will be prioritized. And then also, please, if you can, include your questions in the everyone chat, as opposed to targeting it specifically to myself, Rebecca, Lawrence, whoever it might be, so that others can follow along with your questions and or comments. If there's some reason you need anonymity, then by all means go ahead and we will respect that. Anything else I need to cover in that, Adam?
Yeah, just for folks who weren't here previously, this is the first one you're joining. For the format today, like Zeb said, we're going to do a read through of the language, or possibly in some cases today, just a quick summary. We're going to be hitting all language in the contract, not just things that were changed as a result of negotiations. We'll be highlighting if there were changes in each section. But what we're hoping to have produced at the end of this is a complete video record and run through of the contract that will remain as a resource for folks over the next 4.5 years for the duration of this contract. So if anyone needs to go back and reference and get an explanation of a section, we'll have it there. So because of that, what we'll be doing is, after we read through each section, we'd preferably try to address all the questions we can at that point, so that it's easier for someone perusing down the line to get all the content for that section in one spot. So feel free to jump in during the section with any questions that you may have. Today's presentation is going to be a little more dense than the one was last week, and then the ones are going to be coming up. Today we're going to be going through a lot of the more technical language in the contract. So it will be a little dense, but feel free, again, if anything needs clarification that we're not hitting, we're happy to provide additional clarification. So jump on in.
And if I can hop in for a moment, this was mentioned in the announcements that were sent out for this. This will be recorded. So the last session was recorded, is already up on our YouTube page. Last time I checked, there were more than 350 views. I don't know how many folks are looking at it right now. And then the other issue is that, or the other thing for everyone to be aware of, in addition to the recording, is that we will be responding to questions as well in chat. And for example, somebody just mentioned they're having trouble accessing the PDF. I'm not sure why. I was just able to download it moments ago, but we can post things in chat as well, as you see with this document. So that's being able to be shared. And suggestions also are welcome. So far, we've received very favorable feedback on this format for Zoom meetings. And I just want to forewarn everyone, the contract information that we're discussing today is particularly dense and particularly detailed, and doesn't include some of the more, I'll use the term, sexy items that people are often interested in, like, oh, how do I get my class study? When am I getting my bonus? What about that wage increase, right? This is more the governance and nuts and bolts of the unit. And that's one of the reasons that we're having this 4-part series, is that this is a record that people can refer to in the future. And if you wish to know this information, we think it's important, but it's not going to be applicable to absolutely everybody. So just be aware, today's presentation is particularly detailed. Mm-hmm. And Adam's sharing his screen right now. Could you zoom in a little bit, Adam, for last time?
Yeah,
we got a couple comments on that. And oh, one final reminder before Adam hops into this right here, we will periodically be reposting the same information in group chat, or for example, the contract. That's because people who join midway through cannot see the prior chat log. So we may again go, post the website, or we may again drop the contract in so folks can pick it up midstream.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and jump on in. So we're starting today with Article 1, recognition. As kind of an introduction, there's some basic language in here that you're going to see in most union contracts, setting up just the basic relationship between the union and the employer. But this article has also become a bit of a dumping ground for some other pieces of language that didn't have someplace better to go in the contract necessarily. So those are the pieces that you'll see as we're reading through this. The first part we have in here is section 1.1, exclusive bargaining representative. And we'll start with the language. The county recognizes County Employees Management Association, CEMA, as exclusive bargaining representative for all classified and unclassified employees in coded classifications within the Supervisory Administrative Bargaining Unit. For the purposes of this agreement, an employee shall be defined as a person employed in a coded classification in the bargaining unit covered by this agreement. These employees are considered management employees and are expected to perform the duties and responsibilities required to accomplish their job. Premium pay and other special compensation are inapplicable to CEMA represented employees, except for cash overtime or compensatory time off for those classifications designated by the county as non-exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act, and except for bilingual pay, uniform allowance, night shift differential, pest advisory differential, and vacation add back as provided in this agreement. Okay, so let's stop there and hit a couple of those points. So the first piece is that throughout the contract, I'd like to say that we had a standard way that we referred to both the employer and CEMA, but you'll see various terms used to refer to these, even though this is the definition we have in the beginning. So where the county as the employer is called out, you'll see terms such as the county or the employer used variously. And then for CEMA, as well as CEMA members, you'll see a few different terms used. You'll see CEMA, you'll see the union, you'll see bargaining representative. In some places, you'll see CEMA members, and some you'll see employees. These are all the terms by which each group is referred to. We were hoping in this contract negotiation to get a standardization of terms through the contract, but it's not something that we were able to get. So this is how we're talking about them in this section, but you'll see those various terms used throughout the contract. After that, we get a basic definition of kind of who's in the world that CEMA represents. So under this definition, CEMA is able to represent employees of the county in classified and unclassified positions. We're able to get regular full-time employees and also provisional folks. Who this is going to exclude most significantly would be people that are in extra help versions of CEMA codes. So for example, a program manager 2 is a CEMA code. Anybody in that's eligible to be represented by CEMA. If you're an extra help PM2, you are not represented by CEMA. For all intents and purposes and for administrative convenience, the county often extends similar terms of the contract to those folks, including increases, but that's only an administrative convenience on the part of the county, and there's no obligation for them to do that. The next section we have after that is getting into a little bit of the definition of the fact that everyone here in CEMA, almost everyone, are considered management employees, and most folks here are exempt. This is the first reference that we see to Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA. We'll talk a little more about FLSA later when it comes in more. What's important to know about this section, though, is that it exists as a general statement of philosophy in the beginning, but it does not overrule other language that might guarantee other benefits later on in the contract, where that's relevant, right? We see this section here where it says, we're not entitled to special compensation except for the following list. That list was one time exhaustive of all the other differentials that CEMA folks could earn. It's no longer exhaustive. For example, it doesn't have the CIP differential for our public defender investigators in there. This doesn't overrule any other specific differential that's been bargained for CEMA. This statement exists here in the beginning as a general statement of philosophy and outlines that most folks in CEMA are salaried. They work 40 hours plus or minus without overtime, with the exception of a small number of classifications. And that by and large, we don't have differential pay except where specifically agreed upon. And there's a somewhat long list there, but it's not exhaustive. Anything you'd like to add on there, Zeb?
So an important item just for everyone to keep track of here, as Adam mentioned, extra help is excluded from this, but all other SEMA-linked SEMA represented classifications are. So the questions that we've been getting asked about this are, I'm provisional, I am unclassified. Am I still eligible for the signing bonus? Or will I still see that pay increase? The answer is yes. Who is not contractually entitled to it are extra help and those that are considered SEMA linked. So for those of you, some of you may manage these folks, so it's important for you to understand this, is for example, former ACE or confidential employees that are linked to SEMA are not eligible for these according to the contract. As Adam quite correctly pointed out, the county may choose to give them these, but as a matter of right, it is not theirs. And especially in these budgetary difficult times because of the COVID crisis, the county may opt to not make that offer to those individuals that they're not required to. Thanks, Adam.
Okay. Moving on, employees who are designated as exempt under FLSA in this unit are considered salaried. The rates of pay shown in the appendices reflect the appropriate salary, which is due to the level of responsibility and the inapplicability of the various forms of premium pay and special compensations. The county has designated the following classifications to be non-exempt under the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. There follows a list of our non-exempt classifications. Following that, employees in the above classifications shall receive overtime pay in accordance with FLSA. For non-exempt employees who did not meet the FLSA criteria for different work periods, overtime is defined as time worked beyond 40 hours in any 7 consecutive day work period or 8 hours in any 1 day, 24-hour period. Non-exempt employees assigned under FLSA to work periods other than 7 or 14 consecutive day work periods shall have work periods and daily overtime defined accordingly. So we have a kind of a quick overview of what FLSA is. So in general, there's a hierarchy of what regulations apply to us as employees. The highest level there, we're going to have anything that has the force of law, federal law, state law. The MOU cannot overrule anything that's enshrined in law. Below that, we're going to have contractual agreements between the union and the county. And below that, we'll have policy by the employer. That's basically the hierarchy. The MOU is always going to trump policy, and law is going to trump the MOU. So this definition here of who is entitled to overtime and who is not, this is something that's determined by law, and it's determined by the Fair Labor Standards Act. So FLSA was a piece of legislation, came out in, I believe, 1938, probably the second most significant piece of legislation to come out of the New Deal as far as individual folks are concerned after Social Security. And it does a few important things. It kind of set the standard of what overtime was, and that it was paid at the time and a half rate for excess hours worked. Secondarily, it set minimum wage, which has now been obviously increased above and beyond where it was in 1938. And then it has various protections, including protections against child labor. So this is relevant for us because it sets some basic criteria in place for who falls under that criteria for overtime and who doesn't. The original legislation has been expanded and then variously interpreted by courts, such that there's now a list of criteria that one would look at to determine whether you're entitled to overtime or not. And it's going to include things like the degree to which you exercise independent judgment, whether or not you supervise other staff, etc. Whether or not you meet those criteria for overtime or do not, it's never 100% clear, but it is something that is, again, subject to the law and not subject to the individual MOU necessarily. So what we have here further down is a definition of, for those folks who are able to accrue overtime, how that overtime work is defined. So under FLSA as a public employer, the county is not obligated to treat excess hours beyond 40 as overtime. They're required to treat excess hours beyond 80 in a 2-week period as overtime. The MOU here sets that it's going to be paid on that 40-hour basis. In addition, it's going to be paid on the 24-hour daily basis as well. So for those folks in the above title classifications, this is when they will accrue overtime, and you'll earn it at that time and a half rate that was initially set by FLSA. Anything you'd like to jump in on that, Wissam?
Yeah, if I may, we did have a few questions pop in as we were going through, and we're going to try to address those as they arise. So the first question was, should newly added premium pays be contemplated? And I'm not quite sure what that's a reference to, Diana. So those are paid typically on a bi-weekly basis. There are some exceptions to that. For example, the increase in evening and night shift differentials, there's a specific carve out for how that would be paid hourly. I'm not sure if that's your question. If that didn't address your question, please specify a little bit more. To Matthew's query, yes, we are aware that there is no longer an associate management analyst A and B. Those have been merged into one generic associate, I don't know if generic is the right word, but to a unified associate management analyst code that is paid at the more senior level. So that's an example of what we call cleanup language, that we need to merge those in when we actually print. There's usually no problem with those kinds of, I don't want to call it typographical, but those procedural changes. The reason being, every labor law and this agreement and our relationship with the county all take into account that there are things called successor classifications. So for example, let's pretend park ranger supervisors get retitled to be park ranger managers at some point in the future. Even though we're referring to T29 right here, the successor code would still maintain this contract language. So it is a good point, though, that you raised, Matthew, that we do want to address that. So again, Diana, I'm not sure if we addressed your question. Thank you. I didn't see any others, but Lawrence is helping us track everything in case we missed something. So please continue, Adam.
As allowed by the 7K exemption for law enforcement employees, the county has designated a 14-day work period. Overtime is defined as time worked beyond 80 hours in a 14 consecutive day work period or a regular scheduled shift duration in any workday. Time for which pay is received but not worked, such as holiday, STO, sick leave, and authorized compensatory time off, is counted towards the base period. Employees shall not be assigned irregular work hours to avoid payment of overtime. The county executive shall determine by administrative order those classes and positions which shall be eligible for overtime work and for cash payment. When overtime work is assigned and is authorized by an appointing authority to be worked, compensation for such time worked by non-exempt employees shall be time off with pay computed at the rate of 1.5 hours off for every hour of overtime worked, except that such overtime work shall be paid in cash at the rate of 1.5 times the regular hourly rate when specifically authorized by administrative order of the county executive. Compensatory time off accruals/balance shall be limited to a maximum of 240 hours. So that first bit we hit there sets a different standard for our law enforcement folks. For example, in probation, that their overtime is computed on that 80-hour basis, which would mean, for example, you could work 45 hours your first week of the pay period and then 35 the second week, and that's not going to trigger overtime in the first week. The second paragraph has some protections for us that says, for example, if you've already hit 80 hours worked in your first 8 days of your pay period, you're not going to then have your next 2 days pushed after the next payroll period such that you don't accrue overtime for that pay period. This generally isn't something that SEMA has seen, but there's a protection here trying to ensure that your schedule is not changed. Of course, schedule changes are separately subject to that meet and confer requirement unless it's for an emergency basis, which, for example, we're seeing a lot of right now. There are reasons for which that meet and confer can be abridged, but normally you need to go through that process prior to putting a schedule change in place, and it's significantly too lengthy to do it to avoid payment of overtime in any given pay period. The last piece we have here is about the alternative for compensatory time off as opposed to cash payment of overtime. Anything else that you think you'd like to hit on this section, Zeb?
Yes. So key takeaways: if you're supervising hourly staff, or if you're hourly staff yourself, the language here mentions this. You cannot change people's schedule for the purposes of avoiding the payment of overtime, right? So there is, as Adam points out, there may be emergency circumstances where things need to be adjusted, but normally you cannot do it just in order to avoid the payment of overtime. And of course, as anything, you can do it upon mutual agreement, but that's a different kettle of fish. And emergencies, of course, are exempted. More often than not, we see individuals having a last-minute schedule change. That's when our hourly staff really require our intervention. And also, in case you are someone who supervises line staff or you supervise other, although this is our contract, just be aware that similar provisions apply to other hourly workers within the county. So always something to bear in mind. Then I did have, it's not quite on point, but I did want to address it because the question came in. It was, are there provisions for trainee positions where you automatically get promoted to the higher classification position? In this circumstance, there wasn't again a reference to the management aide and associate management analyst code, but this exists in many classifications, that there will be one classification that is listed as an entry level or an entry level or trainee position. It entirely depends on the practices of that department. There are some, it is not a contractual right, and it's not something that's built in to the job specs for the most part, and especially with regards to the associate management analyst. So oftentimes what it will say is this is a trainee position where we see that people I'm using the term automatically, but there's a huge asterisk with that, is when that position is alternately staffed. Sometimes the departments have a tradition of saying, if you're in this for, you're in this for 1 year, then by tradition, we will promote you to the alternately staffed higher position, non-trainee position. They can do that. It is not an obligation. On very rare occasions, I'm only aware of 3 or 4 codes that are like this, and one of them actually is an EHS, Environmental Health Service, it states you are in this position until 1 year if you obtain the following certification, and then you move into the higher classification. Those are, again, very, very rare, but we do have a few of them. So a management associate analyst and management aide are not one of them, but there are some that exist in the county that if you meet a certain criteria, you do advance. So just wanted to clarify that. I've got a question just now, also again, a little off topic. When will the pay increase go into effect for all county employees? It goes into effect, in fact, March 4th is the first.
May.
I apologize. Thank you. May 4th, the 4th that just occurred. And that's the first day that you will see the increase in your hourly rate and the first day that you will see the reduction in your pension contribution. Yes, and May 4th, not March 4th. Apologies. Please continue, Adam.
Last piece here of this section. All compensatory time off must be taken within 12 months of the date the overtime was worked. Any balance remaining after 12 months shall be paid in cash at the regular rate. Compensatory time balances shall be paid in cash upon separation. An employee may elect in advance to receive compensatory time off credit in lieu of cash compensation for overtime where compensatory time off is allowed, if the appointing authority agrees. So again, just further explanation of taking this compensatory time off in lieu of pay. And again, this only applies to our folks that are in that non-exempt category, being you are not exempt from overtime. Of course, that's got that double negative in there that's a little confusing. We often try to advocate for something similar to this, where we have folks that have been working a significant number of hours beyond their 40 and they are salaried. But in those cases, that's not something that's governed by this section or that we're entitled to. But we've seen that in previous examples at the hospital with the EPIC rollout. That's, for example, something able that Zeb in that case was able to individually get through the meet and confer process for some of those folks involved in the EPIC rollout. This is a way that we can use the ATO section that we have for our salaried employees to try to get additional paid time off when extra hours are worked. But when we're able to do that, for example, like we're gonna make an effort to do with the folks that are putting in so many extra hours for COVID, it's not something that we're entitled to in the contract, either under this section or somewhere else. ATO is not meant to be analogous to this time for time worked beyond 40. It is instead something that we have to push for on an individual basis. Okay. Section 1.2, workload. Most employees in SEMA represented classifications are salaried employees who work the necessary hours to fulfill the duties of the position without overtime pay. Depending on the circumstances, employees may work more or less than 40 hours in a particular work week. The county acknowledges that consistently working excess hours beyond a 40-hour work week may not be in the interest of the employees or the county. If an employee thinks they are working excessive hours on a regular basis, they can request that SEMA and the county evaluate the impact of the workload on the employee. The county and SEMA agree to jointly develop and offer to employees in SEMA represented classifications and executive managers training that would facilitate workload evaluation discussions, including the following components. And then it lists out 5 different criteria. This is the section that we're able to point to when it's necessary that we file a grievance related to workload. If someone's consistently putting in 50, 55, 60 hours on a weekly basis, while this section doesn't have teeth, it doesn't hold the county to necessarily enforce that 40-hour work week. It sets up in the beginning that it's 40 hours plus or minus. The fact that this section exists in the contract for SEMA means that it is grievable if the county is not acting on this language in a consistent and appropriate manner. This is a section that definitely doesn't exist in every management contract that I've seen. So the fact that we have it is of a benefit. And I know in some examples in the past, we have been able to grieve issues using this section and find a resolution. But again, this sets up 2 things. First, which is that as salaried employees, and again, that's 98% of our folks, 95%, we work 40 hours plus or minus, but consistently working excessive hours, not tied to a specific reason, for example, like EPIC rollout or global pandemic, is an issue that SEMA is able to address. The first step to that would be trying to resolve it with the manager that you report to, make sure they're aware of the situation, try and find a resolution. If you're unable to do that and SEMA needs to escalate or file a grievance, this is what gives us the ability to do so. Anything you'd like to jump in there, Zeb? Okay.
No.
We have okay. Section 1.3, documents sent electronically via email. This is one of those sections that I was speaking to that just didn't necessarily have a better place that it needed to belong. But this is new language that SEMA was able to get during the last negotiation session. And it just unfortunately didn't have anywhere necessarily better to sit in the contract, so it got stuck here. The parties agree that documents sent electronically via email are an acceptable form of communication and proof of service for timeline requirements, and it is allowed specifically in place of certified U.S. mail wherever required in the labor contract. The timestamp of the email by the receiving party is controlling. If there is a dispute, the sending party's email record may be used to assist in resolving any timeline requirements. Still unresolved timeline requirements may be items of further dispute relative to the subject matter at hand. Items sent by certified U.S. mail will still be acceptable, but not required. The parties may designate which type of document will go to a specific email address. Each party will give the other party the name or names of persons and their email addresses as official recipient of such documents. Evidence of full mailboxes resulting in non-acceptance by the receiving party or evidence or receiving party email system malfunction experienced by the sending party automatically extends the timeline by one full county business day. So this was an attempt to resolve a couple issues that SEMA had. Timelines are most relevant for our members, specifically with the grievance process and with regards to employees being disciplined. You know, this is something that most SEMA folks never go through, but when you receive a discipline of suspension, demotion, or termination level from the county, the last couple paragraphs in the document that you receive are going to specifically set forth some timelines during which you have to respond, or you can waive your right to respond at all, either to the Skelly level or to a personnel board hearing. Unfortunately, we've had in the last 6 or 7 months or so, some dispute with the county over what appropriate service looks like and who needs to be served. As a result of that, we got 2 sections in here. The first one was ensuring that we were receiving documents via email, and secondarily, that SEMA is entitled, and we'll get to the section in a bit, entitled to receive a copy of all disciplinary actions. The second piece here is that there are often less clear timelines with regards to grievances. We have a responsibility to, once we've learned about an issue and once we've tried to resolve it at the lowest possible level, we are supposed to file a grievance within a timely fashion if that's something that we intend to do. This section is also governing that we can send documents filing a grievance electronically to the county, and that meets the timelines that we have in order for timely filing of grievances. Anything else you'd like to add there, Zeb?
So I think you're going to cover this when you hit the next section in 1.4. The takeaway, the overarching takeaway from 1.3 and 1.4 is we had this language enhanced in 1.4 as a new section included in order so that we as a union can safeguard your rights and timelines. Adam, I'm sure, is going to explain in section 1.4 how we had a several specific circumstances that imperiled those timelines. You have 10 days to get in front of a Skelly officer, 10 working days, and you have 10 working days to appeal to the personnel board as well. And so we don't want to miss any of those timelines. And if snail mail is late or snail mail is not directed to us, that causes, we're already behind the ball when the member notifies us, if the member notifies us, right? Some members are not as sophisticated as others. Many of you on this call, obviously by you being on this call, are more involved in your union. You probably know a little bit more about the contract, a little bit more about your rights. Not everyone is in that same boat. So they may get something that says they're suspended for 2 weeks and they just say, shoot, I don't agree with this, but I'm in trouble. And that's it. And if we don't get the notification and they don't think to reach out to us, that person just blows through their timelines. So that's why this language was included, is to safeguard those folks that maybe are either not quite as sophisticated as some of our members, or it's a stressful situation to get disciplined, right? Maybe you've worked here 20 years, you've never been disciplined before, and you're just not, your head isn't on straight when you get slammed with that 2-week suspension. So again, this is all to protect you all.
Section 1.4, the county shall send SEMA a courtesy copy of all recommended disciplinary actions and final disciplinary actions issued to SEMA represented employees. The form of delivery shall be via electronic mail. The courtesy copy shall be sent to SEMA's designated point of contact within 1 business day of issuing the recommended disciplinary action or final disciplinary action to the employee. For purposes of appeal, it shall be the employee's responsibility to adhere to contractual timelines. SEMA agrees to indemnify the county for any claims alleging breach of privacy resulting from SEMA receiving courtesy copies of the recommended disciplinary actions and final disciplinary actions for SEMA represented employees who are not SEMA members. employees subject to the Public Safety Officer's Procedural Bill of Rights of 1974 are excluded from this section. So like Zeb said, we had some specific issues that came up during negotiations that made this a priority for us. We had one particular circumstance where a member who had been on administrative leave for more than a year and a half received a 300-page disciplinary letter in the mail, and the county took the position that it was under no obligation to provide a copy of that to SEMA, which unfortunately, when we were finally able to get a copy of it, just pushed us right up against the deadline to respond, and then made it very difficult to advocate for that member. We were able to get an individual solution in that case, but safeguarding against circumstances like that is what this section is intended to do. Taken with the previous section, this does not mean that the county is not obligated to provide separate individual notice to an employee. It's not sufficient for the county to just notify the union of any action they're taking. They still have to provide notice to the employee. As the county's practice, they will do that either in person or via certified mail, especially in cases where an employee is on administrative leave and doesn't have access to their email. The final exemption we have here, folks in the sheriff's and in probation are subject to POBAR, which has a whole separate set of rights and protections that they have, being peace officers that go frequently above and beyond what's included here. So it's not that folks are less protected who are covered by POBAR, it's that there are separate and often greater protections that go into effect for anyone in those positions. Take a look at any questions we have. We had a question come in from Michelle related to the previous section that we can tackle now. So Michelle was saying that, yes, we do often work 40 hours plus or minus, and no, it should not be a big deal if you miss 1 or 2 hours in a given week, especially since all of us are frequently working more than those 40 hours. And this is handled variously in different departments. If your department, especially if it's got a separate, funding stream that needs to be tracked carefully, if that needs to be tracked on your Chronos, if you worked 39 hours, 38 hours 1 week instead of 40, ATO is appropriate for tracking that time. But no, you should not be lashed to that 40-hour requirement. We're salaried employees. Anyone that has that issue should absolutely be reaching out to your business rep, and that's something that we can try and address with your manager for you. Okay. I'll give folks a second to have any other questions about section 1 before we move on, because we'll be jumping ahead in the contract quite a way to Article 22.
And while you're giving that moment, I did want to just add, we referenced that they're noticing the county. We've standardized our notification process so that the county now communicates with us through one email address that then we distribute internally. So that's made things less individual dependent, right? If someone's out sick, someone's on vacation, someone leaves, right? We're not there's not just a bunch of emails going to that person's email address and then the union's unable to respond. So we've built in some redundancy to that. You'll see in the coming months, we're also going to be rolling that out for member communication as well. So if you have, although we want to publish and advertise which rep is responsible for which area, if someone's out on a particular day, you can still get your needs addressed as opposed to it parking in someone's inbox. So just want to point that out as well.
Mm-hmm. We had a question from Joanne. Are salaried employees required to have a firm schedule? How your schedule is handled is subject to your department. The MOU doesn't say it needs to be handled one way or another. That'll be determined by county policy and by however your department wants to handle it. So your schedule can be flexible. Some departments do have a firm schedule. Just because you're salaried does not mean that you can't have a specific start time set, for example. You can still have expectations set that say business opens at 8 o'clock and I need you to be here supervising, right on time at 8 o'clock. So that does not exempt you from scheduling requirements. And it's up to your individual department how they want to handle the schedule.
And almost all departments, although it may not be commonly known, almost all departments have a predetermined core business hours. And that's generally when you are expected to be available. That doesn't mean that you have to be in your, I mean, it may mean you have to be at your station, but it may not, right? It may just mean that you need to be available to answer questions from whoever it is you're servicing, the public, your colleagues, execs, whatever it might be.
Okay, let's jump ahead. So we're going to Article 22. Hopefully nobody got motion sick from that fast scrolling there. Article 22 is the Fair Labor Standards Act. The county and the union will comply with FLSA provisions with regards to discipline for FLSA exempt employees. The county and union will meet to develop guidelines to implement the exceptions of disciplining for less than 1 work week. So here's where we're jumping into some of the more technical pieces of the contract. So to be honest, whether or not this article existed within SEMA's MOU, like we talked about before, we're still subject to all federal laws and regulations. We would still have to comply with FLSA even if this section wasn't in the MOU. Sometimes in contracts you get things that are there for recital to make sure everyone understands it, as opposed to necessarily being operative contract language that is doing something specific. This is one of those sections. Like we talked about before, FLSA's the Fair Labor Standards Act came out of the New Deal, and it put some protections in place for employees around child labor laws, minimum wage, and set the standards for overtime. So the most relevant piece for us in that is how it determines who is exempt and who is non-exempt. When positions change, when you, for example, if we've had a position that's changed substantially, previously didn't exercise much individual executive function, didn't manage employees previously, and now it does, individual positions can change with respect to this definition. My experience in other public employers and here, generally, as an employer, you want to err on the side of paying overtime if you think it's a questionable definition. That's erring on the side of caution for the employer, because you don't accrue risk by paying someone overtime to whom you shouldn't be paying overtime. But if you have a large classification who you're treating as salaried, and then it subsequently comes out of wage and hour or from a lawsuit that these folks should have been accruing overtime, it can be an absolute mess to go back and try and figure out how much overtime were all these people working for this period, what's our liability, and how do we pay it. So this is generally something that's treated generously, but folks who are and are not currently exempt or non-exempt, be aware those things can change when positions change substantially. The second piece we have in here, those of you that manage SEIU employees or other line staff employees know that suspensions can be given in varying increments. This section sets forth that SEMA members are disciplined with suspensions in 1 week chunks. So you can be suspended for 1 week, you can be suspended for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you can't be suspended for 8 days. The exception to that is that once a discipline has been issued, your business rep, SEMA, may in some instances seek a settlement with the county. Settlements can reduce suspensions to increments other than 1 work week. So, I have an issue with tardiness and my boss says, okay, Adam, I'm suspending you for 1 week. Zeb, my business rep, can come in and say, okay, county, Adam recognizes that he was tardy, he's not going to do it anymore. Is there a middle ground here where he's not losing a week of pay? We'd be willing to accept a 2-day suspension. It's possible the county will agree to that, and we then have a settlement which is able to, because SEMA is agreeing to it and the county is agreeing to it, it can circumvent this piece of language. But otherwise, you'll always see suspensions that come from the county in that week chunk, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks. Any questions coming up on this section?
Something that I would add to this too, and I realize this applies to a minority of individuals, the personnel board is unable to reduce a disciplinary finding from 1 week to 2 days, as an example, unless and until we develop alternative language with the county. So what this does is it creates an all or nothing scenario with the personnel board if a case gets appealed that far. So if they think that you deserve some form of punishment beyond an LOR, they may have to round up to a full week. Similarly, if they think you deserve 1 or 2 days, they can't give you that, and they may round down to no suspension. So it's a benefit and a cost, just depending on what side of that equation we end up on. Is there anything else on that, Adam? Or if not, I'd like to hop in on the Article 23 labor management collaboration.
Yeah, we had a question come in about notice for suspensions.
Okay.
Yes, so all discipline that has a monetary impact on a public employee triggers your right to due process. So what that means is that if you're being suspended, if you're being demoted, if you're being terminated, the first notice you receive won't say, "Dear Adam, you're hereby terminated, you're hereby demoted." It will be what's effectively an intent letter. It's a recommendation made by the manager, the director, the executive in that situation. And then you're entitled to, at the first step, a Skelly hearing, and then secondarily, a hearing in front of the personnel board. Generally, the actual recommendation, whether it's suspension, demotion, or termination, will go into effect after the Skelly hearing, the first part of that process. So there shouldn't be any circumstance in which you receive a letter and it says you're suspended tomorrow and you're not getting paid. Why sometimes it looks like that happens is that an employee going through this process may be put out on leave, pending a Skelly hearing, pending personnel board, something along those lines. But in those circumstances, the employee is almost always being put on administrative leave with pay. And if you ever find yourself in this situation and you're told that you're off work tomorrow and not being paid, that's absolutely something that you should reach out to your business rep to address. That is almost always going to be incorrect. Okay. Do you want to jump in on Article 23, Zeb?
Yes. So Article 23, labor management collaboration. The county and SEMA agree to establish regular labor management meetings as often as necessary to address needs in a timely way, but no less than twice a year. The purpose of the meetings between SEMA business representatives, including liaisons, and county department management is to proactively address mutually agreed upon agenda items, which may include strategic planning, initiatives, budget, external legislative regulatory updates, staffing issues and trends, discussion of classifications, individuals consistently working excess hours beyond a 40-hour work week, and other items. SEMA business representatives and liaisons shall be invited to meetings, and that any other bargaining groups are invited to when the outcome could impact SEMA represented employees. I realize Adam hasn't scrolled, I think he just stepped away, but that's the conclusion of Article 23. What this means is, of course, it lays out appropriate items of discussion for labor management meetings. We can discuss things beyond this, but it also lays out that we have a right to meet with individual executive personalities at the departmental level. Why this is particularly important is we've had circumstances where outside executive staff have come in and said, I don't have a practice of meeting with line staff or supervisors. They just, I'm just telling them what to do and I don't need to meet with you. This establishes and enshrines that they in fact do need to meet with us upon request. Also, you'll see that for those of you that participate in the labor management meetings, it's not exclusive to just liaisons. We include people that are active in the work site. Usually we send an invite to those that are involved, just a broad email stating that it's going out. For example, we have one tomorrow with behavioral health. I believe that invite was sent this afternoon or yesterday evening. So we want to make that as available as possible. I also know for a fact that many of our departments, especially the smaller ones, do not have a standing labor management meeting. So this is your opportunity to reach out to us as business reps as well to say, hey, we need one. Maybe we want it to be routine. We want it to be twice a year. We want it to be quarterly. And we also have that capacity of telescoping, right? Sometimes there's a flurry of administrative changes, a big reorganization, legislation coming down from the state or federal capital, and we really need to meet. Maybe it's even every 2 weeks, right? Maybe it's every month. But then as things settle down, sometimes we kick things out and then meet less frequently, maybe quarterly, maybe semi-annually. So there is that flexibility as well. Please, if you're a liaison or an interested member that's listening to this, that's on the call, we really want to have these meetings with your staff. It's a great opportunity to build a relationship with the executive team. And it doesn't just need to be, I have a particular issue or I have a particular problem that I need to bring to the forefront. Yes, that's a component of labor relation meetings, but it's also, here's a change that's coming down the pike that we're aware of that's going to happen in 3 or 4 months or even a year, right? Oh, we're purchasing a new building. We're going to be switching locations. We need to figure out something to accommodate a shift change because we know in 6 months our department is going to be going to a 24/7 business model, whatever it might be. These are important relationships to build. These are important budgetary processes to understand. And it's very, very valuable. So I highly recommend it. I see a couple of questions are rolling in here. I see one that seems discipline related. Marilyn asks, how much advance notice must the employee receive prior to suspension? Are there one-day suspensions? So no, not for SEMA. For SEMA, there are not one-day suspensions. As we discussed, that could only occur as a result of some kind of a settlement, and it would be non-precedent setting at this date and time. How much advance notice must the employee receive? Well, it has to go to the Skelly hearing. So you have a minimum of 10 days. And as a practical matter, it should be, usually it's a month or 2 because you get the 10 days, we appeal it to the Skelly hearing officer. Then the Skelly hearing officer usually takes a couple of weeks to make a decision. Usually you don't instantaneously schedule it with them. So as a practical matter, you probably have more than a month. Could it be less than that? Yes, of course. If you just get a notification and it says 2 weeks from now, you're going to be suspended and you're like, yep, I did the deed. I'm not contesting it. I apologize. I was in the wrong. I'm not fighting this. You just take your suspension. It could happen in as little as 2 weeks. Super rare. Usually it's 1 to 2 months out. Okay. Next item is one that we also will need significant help from our members on, which is the contracting out. So notice to the union. The county shall give the union prior written notice of all new proposed contracts valued at $100,000 or more per fiscal year between the county and private third parties for work currently being done by classifications represented by the bargaining unit. This is where we really need your vigilance. What can happen on these types of contract out requests is there's a box that whoever is preparing it checks that says, does this impact bargaining unit work? Check. Yes for SEMA. Yes for SEIU. Yes for RMPA, whatever it might be. Sometimes people just don't check that box, right? So that's that extra review that we're relying on you all for as our eyes and ears. I'll finish reading this and then I'll talk a little bit more about that. Response to notice. Notice from the county as described in section 2.24.1, I see we're missing a space there, is to be given to the union by electronic mail to request a meeting regarding the impact of the bargaining unit. The unit shall respond by electronic mail within 5 working days from date of receipt of the county's notice with a request to meet on the impact of the bargaining unit. Section 24.3. So again, we have 5 days then to respond and say, hey, we want to meet on this. Another mechanism that we have is we can escalate to the Board of Supervisors. Contract renewals and initial approvals go there for 2 readings, and that's also a political avenue outside of the contract that we have. And in fact, I have a specific example of something where we may well be doing that in the immediate future. Section 24.3, meeting. The county and the union shall meet on the impact for not more than 20 working days from receipt of written request from the union. If concerns are not alleviated or agreement is not reached, the county may proceed. The Board of Supervisors may proceed without giving prior written notice if it is determined circumstances exist or will exist that justify urgency action. Reasonable advance written notice. Oops, I can't read that. Written notice of intention to proceed on such a basis shall be provided to the union prior to the board meeting to accept and or approve the county's contract with the third party. But nothing herein shall hamper the board's lawful exercise of authority under state law in emergency situations. So again, this is improved language where they are required now to notify us. We have to have a double check to make sure that they're notifying us. A challenge and shift that we've seen from the county is they will often have these absolutely enormous omnibus contracts. So it'll say, okay, we have this may be an exaggeration, but I'm actually not sure it is, a $30 million agreement for technical services solutions with Acme Staffing Company. So this is going to include printing services, technical authoring, like architecture work, IT services, etc. So it makes it very difficult for us to say, wait a minute, this means that you're actually hiring 50% of the PMO office is contractors. Instead, it's this much larger, broader technical professional services agreement, and it's difficult to see all the different pieces because the county hasn't even committed to that yet. They just have on contract with this technical services company that they can spend up to $30 million. And then at a targeted level, it becomes a significant problem. So we're going to be more present at the board for these. We're going to be relying on you. I know that expiration comes up in October. So we're going to be jumping up and down. That's a real example, the technical services one. We're going to be making sure that we've lobbied, authored the appropriate white papers so that we don't just have a generic approval of these things without our knowledge. I see a couple questions coming in. Is it 10 business days or 10 calendar days? For which section is that, Linda?
I think that's for the notification for advance notice, I think, but maybe Linda can clarify.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, and that's at the end of a disciplinary letter, and the context will be given there that it's working days.
Yeah.
Almost all sections of the contract are going to be working days unless you see something that specifically calls out calendar days. That generally you're going to see working days is the criteria.
Okay. I have a request for an answer about in placement. So again, a little off topic, but it is an important question. I'm wondering how seniority and in placement works. If I am a permanent employee, will someone who got laid off who has more seniority be reassigned and be in place into my current role since I have less seniority? So this is a good question in this environment where we've seen a lot of economic damage from COVID-19, and it's impacting the county's budget. There's no question about it. So I have a very complicated answer for you. If a permanent employee gets laid off and has more seniority, will they be in placed into your current role? So there are several things that would have to happen before you got displaced. The term of art is displaced. Colloquially, people call it bumped, right? So I'm going to make up some codes here. You're an office specialist 3. Okay. Pretend we're all in the same unit. I'll use actual codes then. You're in actual SEMA codes. You're in SSPM 1, Social Services Program Manager 1. A Social Services Program Manager 2 is laid off. Okay, meaning they're the least senior person in that area, and they are reduced. So they're looking around for a place to land. What happens first is they would go to a different vacant Social Services Program Manager 2 position. No threat to you. Okay. Then what would happen is they would go to a classification that they reached permanence in. Let's pretend this person never served their probationary period in the county as an SSPM 1. You would not be in jeopardy at that time. Now, pretend they had. That means that they have rights to the SSPM1 code, and they could bump down or displace you. So then they would come in as an SSPM1. What would happen first is the so-called Emplacement Laws would trigger. So that means that they look around the county for a comparably paid code that they meet the minimum qualifications for that is vacant. If such a code exists, they grab that code and it doesn't jeopardize your position. If such a code doesn't exist, and they had a permanent status in your SSPM1 code, in this example, and you were not just less senior than that person, but the least senior SSPM1 in that area, then you would get displaced. So I realize it's hard to follow this bouncing ball, but a lot of criteria have to be met. The SSPM2 is laid off. There's no other vacant SSPM2 slots in the county for them to go to. Criteria 1. Criteria 2, they look around the whole county. That's me looking for vacancies, right? So they look around for vacancies. Are there other vacancies that they meet the minimum qualifications to and that are comparably paid? If the answer to that question is yes, they grab that vacant funded code. Then they also have the ability to displace extra help and unclassified or provisional. Those folks go first or part-time as well. Then if none of that is going on and they successfully completed, they have permanent status in the SSPM1, and you are the least senior SSPM1, they get their elbow out and knock you out of the way. And then you go through a very similar process. So it creates this big domino effect that has a lot of different things. I know I just spent a lot of time on that. I apologize. It is something that will be very important, and we will be covering it in greater depth with some gamed out examples in a future town hall.
We had a question from Diana about, is there a specific length we can employ individual contractors? And I know in her area, especially with the Epic implementation, there are some that have been there for a very long time. So no, there's no specific length. It's just something that requires, like Zeb was outlining, political pressure on our part when there's an opportunity for us to say something, usually when a contract's up for renewal. That'll be the point that we can step in and say, hey, we're spending X amount of money on this. We need to transition this work to a SEMA member. And that's something that we're sometimes successful and able to do. This is a section that in negotiations, we had a lot more that we were pushing for that we weren't able to get by the end of negotiations. And it unfortunately fell by the wayside compared to some of the other priorities that we had specifically that were more monetary for our current members, you know, talking about pension and wages and realignments and all those things. I would expect there are some specific ways that we can continue to try to improve this section in the next negotiation session 4 years from now. Things that we were looking for here would be things specifically like whenever an RFP or something similar goes out from the county, it needs to include specifically a section. How is this work going to be transitioned at completion of the contract to current staff working for the county? Something along those lines would be very helpful. There's other creative ways that we could try and improve this section. So it's definitely a section that we would like to get stronger language in the future. Unfortunately, where we're at now is that we were able to improve the section in a modest way. What we had found, I don't believe you hit this, Zeb, when we looked at that first paragraph, what it looked like previously is it said all new proposed contracts valued at $100,000 required to be presented in a specific way to the board. And whenever we were finding ourselves not being notified of these, the county would point to that section and say, oh, no harm, no foul, because this was approved through some alternate process. So removing that means that we now have an entitlement to be notified of all of them, which means if that process isn't being followed, we have something that we can grieve then, which is helpful. That being said, it's still a section that we'd like to get more teeth into. And that'll be, it'll be up to members 4 years from now to set priorities for the next set of negotiations. But this was a priority this last cycle, and I would imagine that it will continue to be, and hopefully it's something that we can improve down the line.
Absolutely. Okay, let's see. Oh, I do have a question, and we'll get into strikes and lockouts. This is an important strategic question. The question is, do you have any recommendations as to how to implement or start up a labor management meeting in those initial stages? So yes, the first step I would recommend is to reach out to your business rep. Some of you, and this is a unique circumstance, some of you may have extremely close relationships with executive management. Then it's fine to talk to them. The key here is that a proper labor management meeting cannot occur without the institutional union and the institutional county being present. So you don't have to worry about, you know, Joe Blow in your department decides that they want to have a SEMA meeting with the boss and make some agreement that binds SEMA. That's not how it works. It has to be the institutional union, the institutional county have to get together. So there's not going to be those kinds of backroom deals. We have protection from that, and we also are. I have prided myself on being extremely transparent about when a deal, or not deal is even the wrong word, when there's something that would impact individuals. We'll always bring that to the members to let you all know. So reach out to your rep. Then hopefully your rep and you will have some of that historic knowledge of, are we just bringing meetings back because there was a change in executive leadership? Are we establishing them for the first time? This often happens, does the whole department have a quarterly or monthly meeting, but some subgroup of the department needs to meet separately, right? These kinds of things happen at SSA, at a mammoth institution like HHS, where you have an overarching labor management meeting, but then individual departments like DFCS or DEBS, or at the hospital, VMC or various clinics have to have their own meetings. So that's also a possibility. So yeah, reach out to your rep. We'll do the legwork, talk to executive management. And it's always helpful, Rebecca and Adam may do it a little bit differently. For me, it's helpful to know a couple of the reasons why we're starting the process now. If the reason is you just want to have a solid relationship, then that's great. If there's a particular urgency or a particular circumstance, then obviously as reps, we want to know about that so that we can prioritize resolving those in the initial labor management. Okay, do you want to, well, I don't care. Do you want me to take strikes and lockouts, or do you want to take it, Adam?
I can jump on it. Just a last point on the labor management meetings is that one of the particular strengths that SEMA has for those folks that haven't been involved in this is that SEMA as an institution, as well as individual reps, have almost universally strong relationships with the executives over the various departments. There's some exceptions there. We've had, unfortunately, things that have become individual conflicts that have damaged those relationships. But being able to leverage those relationships is something that helps us get significant and greater benefits for our members when we need an executive to come in and weigh in on something. So that avenue to escalate things when necessary is important. But it's also important that it not just be the individual reps that have those strong relationships, which is part of the important reason to have consistent folks that are involved in that labor management committee. Because should I leave or should Zeb leave, if we're taking with us those relationships, that does long-term damage to SEMA, because then we need to, whoever comes in next needs to rebuild those relationships that existed previously. So I know in all my areas, I try to have folks that show up, consistently every time to the meetings. They're not open invite, because we want to have that group that's been involved consistently. But absolutely, we would encourage more folks to get involved. And if you don't have meetings in your area, would be a great idea to start them. Okay. Article 25, strikes and lockouts. During the term of this agreement, the county will not lock out the employees who are covered by this agreement. The association and association represented employees, both individually and collectively, shall not organize, carry out, cause, encourage, or condone any job actions such as strikes, work stoppages, slowdowns, blue flu, sick outs, work to rule, sit-ins, sit-downs, intermittent strikes, partial strikes, sympathy strikes, or secondary actions such as refusing to cross picket lines or any other individual or concerted refusal to render services, including refusal to work overtime or other curtailment or restriction of work at any time, or to obstruct efficient operations of the county, collectively strike activity by association represented employees during the term of this agreement. If the association learns that bargaining unit employees intend to engage in strike activity, either through notice from the county or through other means, the association will send a notice to all bargaining unit employees with a copy to the Labor Relations Director indicating 1, the strike activity is not authorized or supported by the association, and 2, strike activity may violate county and departmental rules and result in disciplinary action. The association shall take all other steps reasonably necessary to induce employees to seek any and all strike activity. So this is an entirely new section in SEMA's contract that didn't exist before. It's also language that you will see in almost every union contract that's out there. And it does two things. While it's doing, and it lists those two things in the beginning. This is a section that covers strikes and covers lockouts. The piece that speaks to lockouts is only the first sentence. The rest of it is covering the strike piece. Practically speaking, the lockout language doesn't do a lot for SEMA. It would be difficult to imagine a situation where the county wanted to lock out employees. And I think it would be legally questionable if the employer did, if they could stop paying employees in the event they wanted to do a lockout, which would then defeat the purpose of the lockout. Where lockouts are more relevant would be, for example, I run a factory that makes cookies, and I've decided that because of the bargaining process not going the way I wanted, I'm just going to close the factory, shut it down. That means I don't have to pay my workers, and that puts a ticking clock on them to resolve an issue soon, such that they can get back to work and resume being paid. It's just not a situation that we're ever likely to see at the county. And practically speaking, the county also probably can't legally just stop providing services to its members of the county, right? So that language means very little for us. The other part is operative, though, the part that says SEMA is not going to strike. What this applies to, though, is that SEMA will not strike during the term of the contract. So previously, we had an ability to strike at any time that we wanted, including while under contract or while off contract. It would be difficult, additionally, to imagine a circumstance where we wanted to strike under contract. It wouldn't give us an opportunity to renegotiate terms in the contract because the contract's already signed, and it doesn't need to be opened up until the next period for negotiation. And this section does not prevent us from striking as a result of the negotiation process, which is normally the only time where you would want to strike. It's the point where it actually is providing you some leverage to get something. So what this section represents is the basic exchange that most employers are making in their agreements with their unions, which is that on the one hand, the employer agrees to provide economic enhancements over the period of the contract. In exchange for that, the union agrees to not strike over that same time period. That's the basic quid pro quo that exists in most contracts. That just didn't exist previously in SEMA's contract, likely because historically there was just no reason to expect that SEMA was ever going to strike previously. So no one had ever thought to put this section in. As a result of negotiations this year, and specifically the letter that we put out around the time of SEIU strike, letting our members know that you were able to honor SEIU's picket line even though we were under a contract extension. The county then made this a priority to get this language in. It was something the negotiation team identified as something we were willing to give on if we could get other economic enhancements in exchange for it, which we were able to do. So again, this is new language. It didn't exist previously. What it says is that under the duration of this contract, we can't strike. Practically speaking, that's not going to mean a whole lot for SEMA members. We'll pause and see if we had any questions come in.
I'm not seeing any.
Okay.
Nope, me neither.
Okay. Moving on, we have section 26. Article 26, full agreement. It is understood this agreement represents a complete and final understanding on all negotiable issues between the county and its departments in SEMA. This agreement supersedes all previous memoranda of understanding or memoranda of agreement between the county and its departments and SEMA except as specifically referred to in this agreement. All ordinances or rules covering any practice, subject, or matter not specifically referred to in this agreement shall not be superseded, modified, or repealed by any implication or otherwise by the provisions hereof. The parties for the term of this agreement voluntarily and unqualifiedly agree to waive the obligation to negotiate with respect to any practice, subject, or matter not specifically referred to or covered in this agreement, even though such practice, subject, or matter may not have been within the knowledge of the parties at the time this agreement was negotiated and signed. In the event any new practice, subject, or matter arises during the term of the agreement and an action is proposed by the county, SEMA shall be afforded all possible notice and shall have the right to meet and confer upon request. In the absence of agreement on such a proposed action, the county reserves the right to take necessary action by management direction. So this section is doing a couple different things. This is language that you're going to see, not only, for example, in the contract here. If you're ever signing a settlement agreement, for example, with the county with regard to a discipline or a grievance, you'll see very similar language in there. You'll also see language similar to this in contracts you may have entered into in your private life. This is basically saying is that this is the entirety of the agreement. There isn't something else that's been agreed to that's contained separately in a different document or verbally somewhere else. That's the first piece of what this is capturing. The second major piece that this is capturing is that when issues come up, SEMA on the one hand has a right to meet and confer over those issues that are mandatory subjects of meet and confer, changes to working hours, conditions, etc. And if there was a need to have some change to wages, for example, that would be a mandatory subject of bargaining. On the other hand, there's a general kind of sentence of what we refer to as management rights in here at the end, which is kind of a small section for something that could be called management rights. But at the end here, it has this piece saying the county reserves the right to take necessary action by management direction, just saying issues not covered by the contract, authority is retained by the employer is effectively what this is saying. Though only in some very small language. So sections like this, the previous section we were looking at with strikes and lockouts is unfortunately just not written to be clear in what it's saying. It's, the previous section, for example, you could see that it just used terms that weren't included anywhere else in the contract. For example, referring to SEMA as the association, you can kind of see that the fingerprints of who's touched the contract here by the language that's used. That, for example, what wasn't written by the folks in labor relations we were bargaining with, it definitely came out of county council, so they used their preferred nomenclature. And then that just ends up in the contract. That's how you kind of end up with this hodgepodge looking document with, different fingers touching it over the years. I know we mentioned in the last section, one thing we wanted to do was do a complete rewrite on the contract to just standardize and make things more readable. Unfortunately, that'll have to be a priority for the next negotiation session. The necessity to close things out quickly just meant we couldn't afford to spend another month doing cleanup work prior to getting a final deal. But because of that, you additionally are always going to have sections like this that are basically just written in legalese. Anything you'd like to add on to that, Zeb?
No, it's a good point that we had sought to simplify a lot of this language, put historical language into an appendix, and just, with the onset of COVID, we were not able to achieve that. So that's why we're doing, one of the many reasons why we're doing the SEMA recommends is we want to make the language as readable as possible. So there'll be little blurbs down at the bottom of many of the sections explaining what does this really mean to you. And part of the reason why we're going through it now. Okay, I see Adam stepped away, so I can jump into the savings clause, which is where I believe we are. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, if any provision of this agreement should be held invalid by operation of law or by any court of competent jurisdiction, or if compliance with or enforcement of any provision should be restrained by any tribunal, the remainder of this agreement shall not be affected thereby. And the parties shall enter into negotiations for the sole purpose of arriving at a mutually satisfactory replacement for such provision. If the state of California notifies the county of Santa Clara that legislation has been implemented, which assesses monetary penalties to local governments which settle wages and or benefits with increases in excess of certain limits, such as legislation currently pending entitled Assembly Bill 1040, those benefits and or wages shall not be implemented or continue to be paid. The parties shall immediately enter into negotiations for the sole purpose of arriving at a mutually agreed upon alternative. The county reserves the right to cease payment or seek repayment of wages and or benefits upon which the state of California is basing the monetary penalty. The County Employees Management Association reserves the right to contest the legality of the payment, cessation, or repayment. It is understood that the purpose of this section is to ensure that the county does not incur any liability or penalties on either the original agreement provisions or the negotiated alternate provisions. So really what this is saying is we cannot agree to anything that is illegal, okay? So, or that the law of the land changes. So we could not, for instance, enter into a contract that says, guess what? Our hourly employees are ineligible for overtime. Can't do it. There's established law of the land, either California state law or federal law, in this case both, that states hourly employees must be compensated overtime, full stop. I don't care whether SEMA and the county agrees to not adhere to that law, you have to. Similarly, where there are things that govern us all that are, many of you are familiar with OSHA, that set various safety standards. We can't agree to waive those standards that everyone has a right to. So we can always negotiate something that is more restrictive. For example, hourly overtime, we could say you get 1,000% for every hour, not just, time and a half. However, you couldn't do something that's below what the law requires. Similarly, the law changes on us. For those of you that have been here prior to 2013, previously we used to have one pension plan that applied to everybody. Sacramento implemented PEPRA that changed the universe of pension for us and created two tiers, right? So that was a change. We had to comport with the law, and that meant that various bargaining units, their contracts were opened for purposes of that. Similarly, here's an example of something that just happened that we didn't need to enter into negotiations with because it's the law of the land. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act, okay, that just established a bank of 80 hours that individuals could access for childcare, as an example, or to care for themselves or to care for their family. We didn't need to go and enter into negotiations with the county to say, hey, DC passed this law, can you please give it to the SEMA unit? We'd really like to have it. No, they flipped the switch, and that law and that authority and that requirement flows down from the Capitol to us and gets implemented. If for some weirdo reason we wanted to reject that bank, we similarly couldn't, right? We can't say, no, SEMA members are not allowed to access it. I don't know why we'd ever do that, but just as an example. So hopefully that's clear. Do you want to tackle term of agreement?
Sure thing.
Or I think we're on to save. No, yeah, we're on to. Oh, excuse me. One other extremely important point of savings clause, and let me discuss this and why it's there. Savings clauses are frequent for settlements and also for contracts. Another big reason why you have a savings clause is that you say, it's the first line in Article 27, if any provision is held invalid. So what has happened, I'm not saying it would be successful in a labor contract, but what has happened in very lengthy contracts is if one portion of the contract is found to be illegal, sometimes a party will say, oh, the whole thing's done. The whole contract is void now, right? That's what this also a function of the savings clause is. It says if one portion is struck down by a court ruling or is changed because the legislation changes, the rest of the contract is intact. It's just that section that is affected by the law or legal decision or rule change by Sacramento or or a DC. That's the limited, narrow portion that's affected. The whole contract isn't thrown out. That's the real reason for this clause. I don't think I saw any questions pop in on that. Okay.
Okay, Article 28, Term of Agreement. This agreement shall become effective only upon ratification by SEMA and approval by the Board of Supervisors, and shall remain in full force and effect to and including April 6, 2020 through June 23rd, 2024, and from year to year thereafter, provided, however, that either party may serve written notice on the other at least 60 days prior to June 23, 2024, or any subsequent June 23rd of its desire to terminate the agreement or amend any provisions thereof. Upon request of either party, the party shall commence negotiations for the successor agreement no later than 120 days prior to the expiration of this agreement. So those of you that have been following the e-blasts that have been coming out, kind of walking everyone through the timeline here, this is what sets up, one, the term of the agreement, but also what needs to be accomplished for ratification there, final ratification, and that's on both parties. So on SEMA's end, we conducted a vote, which passed, and on the county side, they needed the approval of the Board of Supervisors. Their internal rules dictate that means it has to go through 2 readings. That just happens to be what the requirement is here that's dictated. Other counties you could work at, for example, would have a different process to approve their labor contracts. That specific process isn't enshrined here. It just says that it needs approval by the Board of Supervisors. And then we have the term of our contract that it's going through June 23rd, 2024. The last piece here is that we have an agreement to start bargaining no later than 120 days prior to the expiration of this agreement. I think we started, unfortunately, not that far ahead of time. For this last negotiation cycle, we maybe started a little more than 2 months ahead of time. And part of that's of course part of the reason that we ended up so far past the end of the last contract, though I think we can see how much further we went. I don't know that starting earlier would have necessarily gotten us much of a quicker conclusion. However, it's definitely something that SEMA is looking to act on quicker for the next negotiation cycle. We sent notice to the county well ahead of time. In this case, we just weren't able to get things started before then, partially due to the complex process we were putting in place, having a mediator there for the beginning of our negotiations. If that's something that SEMA decides to try again, doing that negotiation process with a neutral party there, then it's absolutely something where we'll want to be, starting possibly even more than 120 days in advance of the expiration of the agreement. Or if SEMA's determination at that time for that negotiating team is that we just want to start with traditional bargaining, that could be sufficient time depending on the circumstances.
And as far as term of the agreement, a big lesson from this last cycle, which, really I think a lot of us appreciate, but was at least not fully realized by myself. Lawrence may be able to opine as to the e-board members as well, is that with both traditional and with interest-based bargaining, it doesn't really matter what format you're in. It's extremely personality dependent, right? And if you have someone who views themselves as a guardian of the public treasury, as really wanting to maintain the status quo, and that it's some kind of a benefit that like they'll get recognition or accolades by just maintaining the status quo. That's a very different environment than if you're working with a team opposite you that is saying, what's the legitimate issues here? You're our staff too, and we want to move to address these concerns. But then also it has some that's tempered with some wisdom and experience, right? Wait a minute, I hear you want to, triple your on-call thing, your on-call payment. I get that you want that. I don't think that that's really something the county's interested in, right? So I'm not just saying that in order for this to work, the executive team and the labor relations team has to be a bunch of pushovers. What I'm saying is that there has to be an attitude of really, hey, this is a bona fide issue. I understand the pain points you're raising. Let's move to address this. If instead the attitude is, my job is to just pre-say no to whatever it is you've got cooking, find a reason to say no, and then you make me say yes. That's a very different bargaining environment. and unfortunately, I think that is a bargaining environment we found ourselves in for portions of this negotiation. And it really involved, as you all know, and I want to give credit to the membership and to the bargaining team, escalation to the Board of Supervisors, phone campaign, email campaign, showing up in numbers to the board meetings, 290, 280, whatever the number was, 270, 280 people plus. Amazing shows of solidarity, unity, and authoring white papers so that the board knows the critical items that we're advocating for are based on research and are based on common sense application. This isn't just figure it out. I want a bunch of money. Where's my pot of gold, right? It's like, no, let me explain to you how promotion to a loss of pay is such a critical issue. Let me explain to you about how it's not a big deal to liberalize the on-call pay or working from home as we're experiencing right now with COVID and so on. So those issues really can be solved. I think I realize I don't believe Dolores is on the call. She's the only board member that was on at previous IBB sessions. And when we had a partner across the table, it's just a very different tenor than if you don't have that. And I'm not saying universally, but at times we really didn't have that partner to look for creative solutions to things. Do you want to weigh in on that at all? I know, Joanne, you didn't get to comment, introduce yourself, but Joanne, I see your video here is on the call, and Lawrence also was at the table, as was Robin and Adam. If anyone wants to weigh in on that as well.
I think what you said is so correct. Zeb, I think we got a lot of feedback from people that it was taking so long, but truly I want people to know that every time we came to a session, the research was done, the numbers were rechecked and checked again. It's just, I think we started off in a difficult situation, and I hope where we ended up is a benefit to all the members. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
And I think to Lawrence's comment earlier, we're kicking this off, the 98% yes vote is at least somewhat of a strong indicator that a majority of people thought it was a pretty good deal.
Yeah, thanks, Zeb. I have not much more to add. You pretty much said it perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, great. I believe that's the last item in the itinerary.
No, that's incorrect, Zeb. We have a couple more items, side letters and appendices.
Apologies.
Yeah. So some of our side letters were able to be incorporated into the body of the contract. We see that with ATO, for example, which itself wasn't even necessarily a side letter. It was kind of a memo. But we have some things that will remain as side letters that for whatever reason we weren't able to incorporate into the contract, along with our other priorities. And that unfortunately just kind of speaks back to a little bit of this is just kind of a result of the tenor of negotiations that we had. Things like incorporating side letters to make the contract more readable is something that we would have hoped that both sides could have found easy agreement on, that it's a benefit to everyone to just have a contract that is more understandable. You only have to look in one place to find things as opposed to two. And that the general response that SEMA got back on a perspective like that is, well, it's not necessarily the county's interest to have a more readable contract. It's like, well, maybe not in your interest, but so we still have side letters is the long way of saying that, that we need to include in the contract. So here's the cross-departmental opportunity pilot program. So this is at least in my experience, pretty underutilized opportunity that folks have in the county. We'll give it a quick read through real quick. The county is offering selected employees in SEMA represented classifications an opportunity to gain valuable experience by working on a limited basis on an activity or project outside the employee's current job. Each selected employee would spend no more than 10% of working time, not to exceed 6 months, in another department within the agency or across the county for a specified period of time, as agreed upon by the employee's supervisor and the receiving supervisor. The employee would remain in the employee's current classification. This side letter is not grievable. The goal is to maximize the interest and experiences of selected employees in senior represented classifications by providing opportunities to work on short-term projects in departments across the county and to leverage and/or develop the talent and expertise of represented employees for effective county operations. ESA shall oversee this pilot program and collaborate with SEMA to evaluate it. Participation in this pilot program requires management approval before applying. The experience gained by this opportunity can be included on future job applications and resumes. Work out of class does not apply to those who participate in this pilot program. The estimated duration and time commitment for an activity or project opportunity shall be discussed with all impacted departments and shall be agreed upon by the employee and the sending and receiving departments before the start of the project. Estimated duties or time commitment may be changed by agreement by the employee and the sending and receiving departments. Opportunities can be initiated by employees and/or departments. The department receiving the employee shall be responsible for training, supervising, developing a work plan, and providing feedback to the employee. Duties of the activity or project opportunity are generally within the selected employee's current classification. It is recommended that the employee have an assigned work location in the receiving office. The selected employee may be allowed and encouraged to participate in regular functions of the receiving department, such as staff meetings, within the 10% assignment as needed. And we'll leave it there. So this was actually something that we did try to get an improvement on this section and get it included in the contract body as opposed to as a side letter. It was an opening proposal that SEMA had to increase, I want to say it was from 10% to 30% of your time, just as a theoretical allowance for how much time folks can spend elsewhere. It was something the county didn't have any appetite in. And it wasn't a high priority for us, so it fell by the wayside as things progressed. In my experience, this is nonetheless a fairly underused program by county employees. It is a great opportunity for folks that want to get experience working somewhere else, and what's of a particular benefit too is that given how sometimes confusing and not consistent ESA's practices with evaluating expertise to qualify you for other positions, this can be a great way to pick up, some gap and you're missing 6 months of experience in some area to qualify you for a position that you don't have. This is a good opportunity. It would be great if more folks took advantage of it. Part of the issue we had with expanding it is that the county was able to point out that, look, this is frankly an extremely underused provision. Oftentimes there isn't anybody taking advantage of this at any one time. Anything you want to jump in there, Zeb?
Yeah, with this program, look, we've had some success with it, but the success has been really in fits and starts. And for us to make this a real impactful program, I think it's going to take a significant investment of staff and member time, because we're going to have to hold hands with the county and shepherd them through having a warehouse. I'm using the term warehouse, a data warehouse, or some kind of website where it becomes training for executives. They know how they can include people. Things get posted and people apply for it. And it just becomes a routine part of life, much like UBTs at SSA and HHS. It took a lot of investment to get that to become a routine part of life. And it's only routine in some departments. It's not routine everywhere. Right. So it's an important program for those of you that have participated in it. The half dozen folks that I know who have had a really positive experience, but to make it available to everyone is going to require a real investment.
Okay. We have a not yet completed salary schedule that will go there, which we didn't have for the last 5 years. So it'll be great to have an up-to-date salary schedule included in the final printed version. The last piece we have here is included, just for historical purposes. This was the memo, and we won't read the whole thing, that put in place ATO as a concept for SEMA folks. We'll be covering ATO, I believe it's next week on the schedule. it now has its own section in the contract under leave. So this memo is no longer governing. We have actual contract language that determines how ATO is given. For historical reference, though, this was the memo from Luke Leong in 2006, I believe. Yeah, that
That's
put
right.
ATO in place for SEMA members. Okay. Okay, and that brings us to the end of the contract. We don't have any other included side letters. So I know this was a particular long and dense day. Hopefully the work we put in here and all the questions you guys asked will give us a good resource for folks in the future that are looking to understand some of these more complex sections and how they're implemented and what the impact is on them as SEMA members. So thanks to everyone for the great questions you were asking and for your participation.
Adam, we do have one more question from Latha. Do we need SEMA approval to move forward with this program, the Cross-Departmental Opportunity Pilot Program?
No, it doesn't have to come through SEMA.
No, yeah, it absolutely doesn't. You can apply, and there is a method to submit for applications. As I was mentioning, the challenge is that some people have applied and have heard, hey, we've received your application, and then they just don't hear anything else. So it certainly is out there. If you are a supervisor who has a cross-departmental training opportunity, by all means, reach out to us, reach out to your executive manager. Some of your executive managers, a minority, probably an eighth of executive managers, know exactly what to do when somebody wants to shepherd this process through, or one of their supervisors has an opportunity. The majority of people will not know. The majority of executives will not know what to do. And so that's where we can come in, link you up with LED, link you up with, for those of you that know, I'm drawing a blank. Leslie Kroll is the deputy county executive in charge of this program. So it really does have to involve all of those factors in order to move it forward.
So we have just a little bit over 10 minutes left in our session. So I know we've opened up the session to questions throughout, but if there are any other questions, now would be the time to ask them.
Thank you, Lawrence.
And if we don't have any other questions, we'd said last week we were going to spend a little bit of time trying to give some info and tackle outstanding questions on the budget. And because last time we ran over a little bit, we didn't really have time to spend on that. So if there's any particular questions about state of county finances, the budget, what we know we can expect right now, we'll be happy to answer those as well, at least as far as we're able to right now.
And the only challenge with that, I mean, I'm happy to do that. I think the only challenge with that is that may well go beyond a 10-minute discussion.
We'll keep it for the next 10 minutes. And if there are any other questions that are posted in chat after our time, then I'll just write them down so that we can address it later.
Okay.
We had a question there. Can you be bumped by someone outside of your department? Yes, the important factor there for Santa Clara is going to be the classification that folks are bumping in, not necessarily the department, but you need to be qualified to perform the work. And for example, in a broad code like program manager, you can't necessarily assume every program manager is going to be able to do every other program manager's job, right? So classification is more important than department, but folks bumping will need to be able to perform the job of the position that they're bumping into.
When will the final budget be done? You're talking about for this fiscal year? Is that, I think that's the question. So usually the budget is completed in June. So I don't anticipate that there would be any delays this cycle unless there's a reason that they are waiting for maybe federal funding or something that might be COVID related. But normally the budget is finalized at that point. And many of you know that there are not general wage. What am I looking for here? General fund reduction target goals that have been set out to every department. And that obviously impacts different departments in different ways. Some of your departments have heavy reliance on general fund dollars, and others of you have extremely modest or no reliance on general fund dollars. Like, I don't know if there's anyone here from DCSS, but that's in a Department of Child Support Services. That's an example of a 100% state-funded organization, right? So a general fund reduction would not impact that particular organization.
Yeah, or VHP, for example. That being said, those departments are still going to see increased restrictions as set by ESA with regards to things like hiring freezes. Having that independent revenue stream doesn't necessarily insulate you from decisions ESA makes about how hiring, firing, and layoffs and things are going to be handled.
I don't seem to be seeing any more questions, guys. Do you have any comments, last comments to make before we close off? Oh, wait, one more question from Diana.
Yes. So the hiring freeze, there's been a general memo, I believe it was 2 Thursdays ago now, that was sent out asking if, or excuse me, requesting and requiring the departments to have a hiring freeze. In-flight recruitments are being allowed to continue. And of course, those positions that can be justified are going to the committee and being greenlit. So it's not I mean, last cycle, for those of you that were in the downturn, the term was soft freeze. So there was a soft freeze, possibly a thaw. I don't know quite how to characterize it. And then it ultimately became a hard freeze as the budget circumstance worsened. So as of right now, it's I would even call it like a review. I think there's an additional review right now, and hirings are still moving forward. Yeah.
How about?
Go ahead.
No. I said it looks like Diana. I just added. How about limiting recruitment to internal transfers?
The restriction or additional requirement for review is applicable to everything. So that would include internal any open position that people have to apply for and get. It also applies to that.
Yeah, I think the question was, would it be a good idea to say that during this period, all positions should be filled via internal transfer if there's going to be layoffs? It's definitely a thought. To the point I would have, Diana, is that if anyone was to come in from the outside and then layoffs were to go into effect, that would be the first person out the door because they'd have negligible seniority in their position. There's
and probationary
often,
staff go first.
Yeah, and they'd be probationary, so those would be the first positions you'd look at limiting. So the impact of that is something that kind of exists anyway. But yeah, it's definitely a thought about, how else can we prioritize internal transfer as opposed to bringing folks from the outside, given that we could be looking at layoffs.
And I do have a question from Veronica Marquez, who messaged me privately. No, we did not cover this previously, and it's not confidential, so that's why I mentioned your name. It was, do we have an idea of when the lump sum payments will come? Our expectation is that it will be this pay period. There's the possibility that it would happen a pay period late, but I've heard everything that we're on target for receiving it this pay period.
Yeah, though Seema said we're okay with it coming as late as June, given the additional consideration we got on how the tiers are being calculated after the contract was signed. So definitely by June, hopefully this paycheck or the coming one.
And as a reminder, that additional consideration is anyone who was on the cusp. So let's pretend you were earning 50 cents below what you needed in order to be in the next highest tier. Unfortunately, based on the prior contract language, sad day, you would not be able to get that higher lump sum payment. However, what we got from the county was acknowledgement that they would build in the 3% wage increase. So you get 3% first and then assess the tier. So it pushed, I think, what was the number, Adam? 100 members or so into the next tier. So that's a benefit to a lot of people that will realize some additional money in your pocketbook.
Yep.
For those that use a pocketbook, I don't know why I said that.
Yeah, I think at this point we are out of time. I would like to ask Adam, Zeb, do you guys have any closing thoughts before I wrap everything else up for us?
Yes, so 5/4, yes, it is 5/4. It is the 4th of this month is when we were expecting, you should expect to see it on this paycheck of this pay period, at the closeout of this pay period. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Lawrence, and the PD group for organizing this event. This is the first time that we have hosted these kinds of events in not in a live format. So hopefully this was helpful for people. I do want to echo what Adam said. This is probably the densest and least sexy, if I can use that word, of the various contract deep dives that we have. So thank you for sticking with it. Hopefully it was educational for you all.
I'm definitely enjoying the time lapse we're getting of Zeb growing a beard from week to week. We'll be able to document the progress.
I agree,
I am
Adam.
living for it.
I'll say.
Deb, quit stealing my line.
Well, anyways, I do definitely want to say thanks to everyone who's listening in, whether live or as a recording. We will publish this and send this out to all of our members. As I've mentioned before, we, the SEMA Executive Board, the SEMA Negotiating Team, our SEMA and OE3 business reps, all serve at your pleasure. And it's because of your engagement, involvement, your commitment, your support, that we were able to achieve the success with this contract that we would not have been able to without you. With that said, I'd like to also remind you that next week will be our 3rd session out of the 4 sessions. We are going to hit HR practices next week. Basically from Article 12 to Article 21, we're going to talk about work out of classification, lateral transfers, layoff procedures, grievance procedures, letter of reprimands, performance appraisals, alternate work schedules and teleworking, safety shoes, and probationary period. So if you do have any questions about today's session and we weren't able to get to it, then feel free to email that to us. If you also have any comments or suggestions of how we can make this better for you, then please feel free to email me. You can either search for me on Connect or on global address list, lawrence.arias@isd.sccgov.org. Otherwise, thank you again, everyone, on behalf of the Executive Board, the PD Committee, our business reps, our hardworking business reps. Thank you to everyone. For those who are sheltering in place, stay safe, stay healthy. For those who are working in the front lines, same to you, but also thank you so much for all the work that you do. We are ever thankful. So with that, again, I'm Lawrence Arias, and we are signing off for today's
Happy
session.
Mother's Day to all the mothers out there.
Yes. Thanks for the reminder, Robin. Happy Mother's Day for everyone.
Yes, happy Mother's Day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.